Within weeks of the first murders, the killer did something investigators had never seen before. He wrote to the newspapers. Inside the envelopes were strange symbols, hidden messages, and a chilling promise. If the code was not published, more people would die. Zodiac. The letters. In July 1969, the investigation into the Vallejo shootings was already struggling to find answers. 2 attacks had left multiple victims, the killer had disappeared into the darkness, and detectives had very little evidence to follow. But then, something unexpected happened. Newspapers across Northern California began receiving strange envelopes. Inside them were handwritten letters, detailed descriptions of the attacks, and pages filled with mysterious symbols. The writer was not asking for money. He was not trying to escape. Instead, he was inviting the world to play a game of codes, messages, and attention. And with every letter that arrived, the man behind the murders began building something far more powerful than fear. A legend. The Zodiac. After the murders in Vallejo, investigators were still trying to understand what they were dealing with. How did the Zodiac case begin? Watch episode 1, The First Murder. The attacks had been sudden, brutal, and deeply unsettling. 2 separate crime scenes, multiple victims, very few answers. At first, the case looked like a familiar kind of nightmare, a violent attacker striking in the dark and disappearing before anyone could stop him. But in the weeks that followed, something changed. The person behind the shootings did not remain silent. He reached for something else, something far more dangerous than a weapon. In July 1969, newspapers across Northern California began receiving strange envelopes. They were not ordinary letters from readers, and they were not harmless pranks. Inside were handwritten messages describing the attacks in chilling detail, along with strange coded symbols arranged in neat, deliberate patterns. The letters had been sent to 3 separate newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each paper received a different section of what appeared to be a larger cipher. The writer was not simply confessing, he was performing. The letters included details about the shootings that had not yet been released to the public, information only the killer or someone very close to the investigation should have known. That alone was enough to alarm police. But what made the letters even more disturbing was the tone. The writer was not panicked. He was not remorseful. He was calm, demanding, and almost theatrical. He wanted the newspapers to print his coded message on their front pages. And if they refused, he warned that he would continue killing. That threat changed everything. Now the investigation was no longer confined to police reports, witness statements, and ballistics evidence. The case had spilled into the public world. Newsrooms, editors, readers, and entire communities were suddenly drawn into it. The killer had found a way to force himself into people's homes without ever stepping inside. Through ink, symbols, and fear, he had made himself impossible to ignore. What arrived in those envelopes was more than evidence. It was an announcement. The man the police were hunting did not just want to kill, he wanted to be seen. Inside the envelope sent to the newspapers was something investigators had never encountered before in a murder case: a code. At first glance, the pages looked almost childish. Rows of strange symbols filled the paper: circles, triangles, crosses, and unfamiliar shapes arranged in neat columns. Some resembled letters, others looked like small drawings. But together, they formed something far more complex than random scribbles. When the 3 newspapers compared the letters they had received, A pattern emerged. Each paper had been sent a different section of the same cipher. When placed together, the pieces formed a message containing 408 characters, what would later become known as the Zodiac 408 cipher. The instructions from the writer were clear. The newspapers were to print the coded message so the public could try to solve it. If they refused, he warned, he would continue killing. For investigators, the discovery immediately raised difficult questions. Serial killers sometimes wrote letters, some sent taunts, others bragged about their crimes. But sending a cryptographic puzzle to multiple newspapers was something entirely different. This was not just communication, it was a performance. Police quickly contacted the FBI and cryptography experts, hoping that trained specialists could decipher the strange symbols. The cipher appeared to be a substitution code, where symbols represented letters. But it was more complicated than that. Some symbols might represent the same letter, others might be deliberate misdirection. The message had been designed to slow down anyone trying to read it. While investigators struggled to understand the cipher, the newspapers faced their own dilemma. Printing the code meant giving the killer exactly what he wanted: attention. But refusing to print it could provoke more violence. After intense debate, the newspapers made their decision. They published the cipher, and almost overnight, the mystery spread across the country. People began cutting the strange symbols out of the printed pages and carrying them home. At kitchen tables and living room desks, families studied the patterns together, trying to find meaning in the unfamiliar shapes. Some readers carefully copied the symbols into notebooks, convinced they might be the ones to solve the mystery. Soon, police departments began receiving letters from strangers claiming they had cracked the code. Teachers discussed the puzzle in classrooms. Amateur codebreakers mailed their theories to newspapers. Across California, thousands of people were now staring at the same page of symbols, all trying to unlock the mind behind the murders. The strange symbols appeared in newspapers, on television broadcasts, and in classrooms. People clipped the message out of the paper and studied it at their kitchen tables. Teachers brought it into their lessons. Amateur codebreakers began analyzing it late into the night. Across California, and soon across America, thousands of people began staring at the same page of symbols, trying to understand what the killer wanted to say. But the police had no idea that the person who would finally solve the message was not a professional cryptographer. It would be an ordinary couple, and their discovery would reveal something deeply disturbing about the mind behind the murders. As the strange symbols spread across newspapers, thousands of people began trying to solve the puzzle. Some treated it like a game. Others believed they might be helping to catch a killer. Professional cryptographers examined the message. Police departments passed it to federal investigators. Military analysts looked for patterns in the symbols. But days passed, then weeks, and no one could solve it. The cipher remained silent, yet far from the major cities and police headquarters, the message had reached a small town called Salinas, California. There, a quiet couple sat at their kitchen table studying the strange symbols printed in the newspaper. Their names were Donald and Betty Harden. Donald was a high school history teacher. Betty enjoyed puzzles and word games. Like thousands of others, they had become curious about the mysterious code. But unlike many people studying it, they began to approach the message with a simple assumption. Betty suggested something that would prove to be crucial. She believed that whoever wrote the message would probably use the word "I" very often. If the killer was boasting or describing his crimes, he would likely talk about himself repeatedly. It was a small idea, but a powerful one. Using that assumption, the Hardens began testing the symbols. They looked for repeating patterns that might represent common words. Slowly, pieces of the message began to reveal themselves. The more they worked, the clearer the pattern became. The cipher was not random, it was a substitution code, and line by line, the hidden message began to emerge. When the Hardens realized what they were reading, they contacted authorities. What they had uncovered was not a confession in the traditional sense, it was something darker. The message was written by someone who wanted the world to know exactly how he felt about killing. And what he felt was not guilt, it was excitement. Soon, investigators would read the decoded message for the first time, and what they found inside the cipher would reveal a disturbing glimpse into the mind of the man who would soon call himself Zodiac. One message solved, but the Zodiac mystery was only beginning. When Donald and Betty Harden finished decoding the cipher, the result was quickly passed to investigators and the FBI. For the first time, the strange symbols printed in newspapers across California had been translated into plain English. What the message revealed was deeply unsettling. The writer did not sound frightened. He did not sound regretful. Instead, the message read like a chilling declaration. The decoded text began with a sentence that would become one of the most infamous lines ever written by a serial killer. "I like killing people because it is so much fun." The writer compared murdering human beings to hunting animals in the forest. He described killing as thrilling, something that gave him excitement and purpose. According to the message, humans were the most dangerous animal of all, and taking their lives was, in his words, more exciting than hunting wild game. But the message did not stop there. The writer claimed that when he died, he would be reborn in paradise, and the people he had killed would become his slaves in the afterlife. To investigators, the statement suggested a disturbing mixture of fantasy, control, and grandiosity. This was not simply someone describing a crime. This was someone constructing an identity, someone who believed that the act of killing gave him power, not just in life, but even beyond it. The message continued for several paragraphs, repeating the same idea in different ways. Killing was exciting. Killing gave him pleasure. Killing made him feel powerful. But when investigators reached the end of the decoded cipher, they expected to find something else. A name. After all, the writer had teased the public with threats and puzzles. It seemed likely he would eventually reveal who he was. Instead, the message ended with a final twist. "I will not give you my name." The killer had forced an entire region to study his message. He had threatened the press, he had taunted the police, and after all of that attention, he refused to identify himself, at least not yet. Because only a few weeks later, another letter would arrive at a newspaper office. And this time, the writer would introduce himself with a name that would soon become known around the world: Zodiac. For a brief moment after the cipher was solved, it seemed like the mystery might finally slow down. The message had been decoded. Investigators had gained a glimpse into the killer's thinking. And although the confession was disturbing, at least the strange puzzle had been solved. But the silence did not last long. On August 4th, 1969, another envelope arrived at the offices of the San Francisco Examiner. At first, it looked similar to the previous letters. Plain paper, handwritten text, and the same unsettling tone. But as editors began reading the message, one line immediately stood out. The letter began with a simple introduction. "Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." It was the first time the writer used the name. Until that moment, Investigators had been dealing with an unknown attacker connected to the Vallejo shootings and a cryptic cipher. Now, suddenly, the case had a title, a name the killer had chosen for himself: Zodiac. Within days, the name began appearing everywhere. Newspapers printed the letter again and again, often highlighting the strange signature at the bottom, a simple circle crossed by 2 lines. Some readers believed it looked like the sight of a rifle. Others thought it resembled a mysterious symbol or personal emblem. Whatever its meaning, the image quickly became inseparable from the name Zodiac. Radio programs discussed the letter. Television anchors spoke about the killer who seemed eager to communicate with the public. Reporters repeated the name in headlines, articles, and evening broadcasts. For the first time, the case was no longer just a series of shootings in Northern California. It had become something larger, a story with a name and a symbol the entire country could recognize. The letter continued with the same strange mixture of arrogance and mockery that had appeared in the earlier messages. The writer complained that police had not correctly described him after the attacks. He suggested that officers had stopped him and spoken with him, but had failed to realize who he really was. Then he added a new symbol at the bottom of the page, a circle with a cross through it. The mark resembled the sight of a gun scope, a target. That symbol would soon become one of the most recognizable images connected to the case. It appeared beneath the letter like a signature, a personal emblem the writer wanted the world to associate with him. To investigators, the letter served 2 purposes. First, it reinforced something they were beginning to accept. The person writing these messages was almost certainly the real killer. The letters contained details that had never been publicly released, information only someone present at the crime scenes could know. But second, the letter revealed something even more troubling. The killer was not hiding. At least, not in the way investigators expected. Instead of disappearing into silence, he had chosen to step forward and create an identity, a character, a persona designed to capture attention and spread fear far beyond the places where the murders had happened. The shootings in Vallejo had terrified a community, but the letters were beginning to do something much larger. They were turning the killer into a story, and the name Zodiac was about to spread across newspapers, television screens, and police reports throughout the country. Even after the letters and the cipher were decoded, investigators still faced an important question. Was the person writing these messages truly the killer? Or was someone simply taking advantage of the fear spreading across California? False confessions were not uncommon in high-profile cases. When murders attracted media attention, people sometimes contacted police claiming responsibility for crimes they had never committed. Investigators needed proof, and soon the letters began to provide exactly that. Inside the messages were small details about the attacks in Vallejo, details that had never been shared with the public. The writer described how the victims had been positioned in the car. He mentioned the weapon used during the shootings. He even referenced moments from the attacks that had only appeared in confidential police reports. These were not guesses. They were precise. To detectives working the case, the conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The person writing the letters was almost certainly the same person who had pulled the trigger. But the most unsettling part was not just the accuracy of the information. It was the tone. The writer did not sound nervous about being discovered. He did not ask for money or make demands for escape. Instead, he seemed almost amused. The letters were written as if the murders were only the beginning of something larger, a performance, a challenge, a strange game played between the killer, the police, and the public, watching from the outside. And with every letter published in the newspapers, the killer seemed to gain exactly what he wanted: attention, fear, and a growing reputation. But investigators were beginning to realize something even more troubling. The letters were not simply communication, they were invitations. Because by publishing the messages, the newspapers had unknowingly helped create the very thing the killer wanted most: a stage. And now that he had the attention of an entire region, the man calling himself Zodiac was not going to disappear. In fact, he was just getting started. By the end of the summer of 1969, the investigation had taken a strange turn. The police were no longer only searching for a man who had committed murders, they were searching for someone who had turned those murders into a public spectacle. Through letters, codes, and carefully crafted messages, the killer had managed to pull an entire region into his world. Newspapers were publishing his words, television stations were discussing his ciphers, and across the country, people were trying to understand the mind of the man who called himself Zodiac. What made the situation even more disturbing was how deliberate it all seemed. The letters were not random. They arrived at carefully chosen moments, always written in the same strange voice, confident, mocking, and strangely calm. The writer seemed to enjoy the attention. He spoke directly to journalists, to investigators, and sometimes even to the public itself. It was as if the crimes were only one part of the story. The rest was the game. A game of messages and puzzles, a game of fear and fascination, and with every new letter, the killer seemed to tighten his grip on the public imagination. Investigators were forced into an unusual position. They could not simply ignore the messages, because the letters contained real information about the crimes. But every time the newspapers published them, the killer received exactly what he wanted: an audience. The man behind the letters understood something important. Violence created headlines, but mystery created obsession. By hiding his identity behind symbols and ciphers, he had turned the investigation into something larger than a typical murder case. It had become a puzzle the entire country wanted to solve. And as the name Zodiac spread through newspapers and television broadcasts, the legend of the killer began to grow. But the story was far from over. More letters would arrive, more codes would appear, and the strange symbol he had signed beneath his messages, the circle crossed by a simple line, would soon become one of the most recognizable marks in the history of criminal investigations. Because the man calling himself Zodiac had not finished speaking. Next on True Echoes. The letters did not stop. Instead, they became more frequent and more disturbing. The man calling himself Zodiac continued writing to newspapers, sending new codes and new threats. But one message would change everything. In it, the killer described a terrifying plan, an attack that could target something far more vulnerable than before: a school bus. Suddenly, the fear was no longer limited to dark roads or quiet lovers' lanes. It was moving into everyday life. Next on Catching Killers, the Zodiac Killer, the threat. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. In fact, the most unsettling messages were still to come, and decades later, the question still remains: who was the Zodiac? What do you think? Was the Zodiac ever truly identified, or is the real story still hidden? Share your thoughts in the comments. To be continued.